The airport was alive with the usual morning chaos. Rolling suitcases clattering across the tile, announcements echoing over the loudspeaker, and the steady hum of travelers moving from one gate to the next. For most, it was just another day. Another flight, another destination. Flight 227 bound for Denver looked no different from the others on the departure board. Passengers lined up at the gate, clutching coffee cups, boarding passes, and weary expressions. Among them was an elderly woman, small in stature, wrapped in a modest navy blue coat that had clearly been worn for years. Her silver hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head, and in her hands she carried a worn leather handbag. No rolling luggage, no backpack, nothing but that one bag. The gate agent greeted her kindly, but she waved away assistance with a polite smile. She had traveled alone before. She knew the routine. When she stepped onto the plane, the other passengers hardly noticed her. They were too busy wrestling for overhead bin space, calming restless children, or checking for messages before switching their phones to airplane mode. She made her way down the narrow aisle, her movements steady but unhurried, as if she had no intention of disturbing anyone. Her seat was near the back, 22F, a window seat. She lowered herself carefully, placed her handbag on her lap, and exhaled with a soft sigh. As though relieved, the first part of her journey was already behind her. The flight attendants moved briskly, guiding people to their seats, helping lift heavy bags into the bins, reminding families to keep seatbelts fastened. They passed by her with polite efficiency, seeing her as just another traveler, another quiet, elderly woman making her way across the country. But one attendant, a young woman with sharp eyes, paused for half a second. There was something about the way the passenger held herself, upright and composed, that didn't quite match her fragile appearance. Still, she said nothing and continued down the aisle. As the engines roared to life and the plane pushed back from the gate, the cabin filled with the usual mix of emotions. Some passengers braced themselves nervously for takeoff. Others leaned back, already slipping into sleep. A few children pressed their noses against the windows, marveling at the sight of the wing cutting through the rising morning fog. And in C-22F, the elderly woman sat very still, her hands folded neatly on her handbag. She closed her eyes as the plane began to taxi, her lips moving faintly as though whispering something only she could hear. When the jet lifted into the sky, climbing higher and higher above the sprawling suburbs below, she did not flinch. Instead, she opened her eyes and looked out at the vast expanse of clouds stretching across the horizon. Her gaze was steady, unblinking, almost reverent. For her, the sky was not unfamiliar. She had seen skies like this before long ago in another lifetime, when the sound of roaring engines meant something very different. But no one around her knew this. To the young man across the aisle, she was just a grandmotherly figure, perhaps, visiting family. To the businesswoman in the next row, she was simply another quiet passenger who would not disturb the flight. To the boy kicking the seat in front of him, she was invisible. Yet there was something in her presence, and something unspoken, something that seemed to hum beneath the surface, that set her apart. If anyone had looked closer, they might have noticed the faint scars along her knuckles, or the way she sat, with a posture not learned in comfort but in discipline. But no one looked. She preferred it that way. For now, she was just passenger 89 on Flight 227, a number on a manifest, another face in the crowd. She blended into the background, unseen, unnoticed, and unremarkable. But fate had a way of drawing the past into the present, and soon, the quiet woman in seat 22F would no longer be invisible. Soon the skies themselves would remember her name, and, hour into the flight, the cabin had settled into its usual rhythm. The hum of the engines blended with the occasional chime of a call button, and the soft murmur of conversation. Business travelers buried themselves in spreadsheets. Children lost themselves in cartoons flickering on tablets. The elderly woman in 22F sat quietly, hands folded on her handbag, eyes drifting between the window and the pages of a small paperback she carried. She looked peaceful, but around her a quiet ripple of curiosity was beginning to form. It started with the man across the aisle, a middle-aged traveler in a worn blazer, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. He glanced at the woman, Once, then again, lingering a moment longer the second time. Something about her face tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. He leaned closer to his seatmate, lowering his voice. "She looks familiar, doesn't she?" His seatmate shrugged, uninterested. But the idea had been planted. Soon others were sneaking glances in her direction. A young woman 2 rows ahead, twisted slightly in her seat, pretending to adjust her blanket while stealing a look. A college student with earbuds pulled one out, tilting his head as if to get a better angle. Whispers traveled like a current through the cabin, soft at first. Then gathering strength, one passenger thought she looked like someone from a history book. Another swore they had seen her in a documentary about World War II medics. But that seemed impossible. The woman in 22F looked far too gentle, too quiet, to be anyone tied to such a brutal chapter of history. Still, the murmurs grew, curiosity feeding on itself, building an invisible circle of attention around her. Meanwhile, the woman herself remained oblivious, or perhaps deliberately indifferent. She turned the page of her book with a steady hand, her gaze never lifting to acknowledge the eyes upon her. If she heard the whispers, she gave no sign. For decades, she had grown accustomed to living quietly, stepping out of the spotlight she once found herself in. Fame had never been her pursuit. Duty had been. But the world has a way of remembering its heroes, even when they try to remain hidden. A teenage boy across the aisle finally broke the silence of speculation. Pretending to fumble with his phone, he zoomed in on the passenger list displayed briefly on the screen of a flight attendant's device. He caught her name. Margaret Ellis. He typed it into a search engine, expecting nothing more than a routine biography of some grandmother. What appeared instead made his eyes widen. He scrolled quickly, reading snippets aloud to his mother in a whisper. She was a nurse in the army during World War II. Says here she served with air squadrons in Europe. Treated wounded. Pilots. Oh my God, she received the Silver Star. The words hit like sparks in dry grass. His mother leaned closer. A man 2 rows up turned his head sharply. Someone else pulled out their phone, typing furiously. In moments, a ripple of recognition swept through the cabin. The quiet old woman at the back of the plane wasn't just a grandmotherly figure on her way to Denver. She was a decorated war hero, a survivor of chaos most people had only read about in books. The whispers sharpened into reverent tones. Passengers leaned across aisles sharing what they found online. She saved dozens of men under fire. They said she dragged soldiers from burning wreckage. She patched pilots with her bare hands when supplies ran out. The cabin atmosphere shifted. It was no longer a routine flight filled with strangers. There was a sense of awe, of history come alive, of being in the presence of someone extraordinary. People stole glances at her with newfound respect, their eyes no longer curious but humbled. And yet she remained still, quietly reading her book as though the legends attached to her name belonged to someone else entirely. She neither confirmed nor denied the whispers. She simply let the sky carry her forward, silent as ever. But respect has a way of traveling faster than sound. Soon her identity would reach not just curious passengers with smartphones, but the ears of pilots flying nearby. And when they heard her name, the sky itself would change. At 35,000 feet, most flights blur into routine. Pilots speak in clipped radio calls. Controllers juggle dozens of blips across their radar screens, and passengers pass the time with books, movies, or restless naps. Flight 227 was no different. At least that's how it appeared. But air traffic control in Kansas City noticed something unusual. A line of storms was forming ahead, narrowing the corridor for civilian flights. To keep the sky safe, controllers rerouted 2 A-10 Thunderbolt II jets from a nearby training exercise. Their mission was simple: provide an escort for Flight 227 through the congested airspace until the weather cleared. It was precaution, nothing more, the kind of decision that rarely made headlines. The A-10 pilots acknowledged the order with professional calm. Call signs Viper 1 and Viper 2 adjusted their flight path, banking sharply toward the commercial jet's location. They expected nothing remarkable. To them, this was another assignment, Another day in the cockpit of machines designed for war but now cruising peacefully in peacetime skies. Inside Flight 227, the captain received word of the escort. It was unusual but not alarming. He assured his crew and passengers that everything was fine, though curiosity buzzed in the cockpit. Through the windshield, they soon caught sight of two gray silhouettes approaching, their wings broad, engines steady like hawks sliding into position. Passengers noticed too. Heads turned toward the windows. Murmurs spread. Are those military jets? Why are they here? Is something wrong? Nervous energy rippled through the rows until the captain's voice reassured them over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing to worry about. We're being given a precautionary escort due to weather patterns ahead. Enjoy the view. It's not every day you see Air Force pilots flying with us. Laughter broke some of the tension, but not all of it. The presence of the A-10s felt heavy, commanding even to civilians who knew little about aviation. The warplanes looked almost predatory beside the smooth white body of the passenger jet. Children pressed their faces to the windows in awe. Adults snapped photos on their phones, eager to capture the surreal sight. Back in seat 22F, Margaret Ellis lifted her eyes from her book. She glanced out the window, and for the first time since boarding, her lips parted slightly. She recognized those planes instantly, not by their make or their model, but by the sound. The deep growl of their engines carried an echo of the past, a reminder of the warbirds she had once heard roaring overhead on the battlefields of Europe. Her eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment she was no longer a passenger on a quiet commercial flight. She was a young lieutenant again, standing in mud and smoke, listening for the salvation of aircraft above. The first officer, meanwhile, had been following the same whispers circulating through the cabin. During a short break in duties, he pulled up the flight manifest, curiosity gnawing at him. The name confirmed it. His breath caught. Lieutenant Margaret Ellis. Could it be the same one? He quickly searched on his tablet, skimming records, photos, and commendations. There was no mistake. Heart racing, he leaned toward the captain, showing him the screen. The captain's brows rose sharply, his eyes flicking toward the cabin door. Seat 22F, he whispered. The first officer nodded. Silence lingered for a moment before the captain made a decision. He pressed the call button for the lead flight attendant. Moments later, the attendant approached the elderly woman, her voice hushed, respectful. Ma'am, the captain would like to invite you to the cockpit if you're comfortable. Margaret blinked, surprised, but after a pause she nodded. Slowly, carefully, she stood, clutching her handbag as she followed the attendant down the aisle. Passengers watched in silence, the whispers sharpening into realization. Something extraordinary was unfolding. When she entered the cockpit, the captain greeted her warmly, helping her into the jump seat. It's an honor, ma'am, he said quietly. Then, with a careful gesture, he handed her the radio headset. Outside, the A-10s cruised closer, their pilots unaware of who had just taken her place beside the captain. That was about to change. The cockpit was calm, filled with the steady drone of engines and the occasional beep of instruments. The captain adjusted his headset, stealing glances at the woman seated in the jump seat beside him. She sat straight-backed, hands resting lightly on her handbag, her expression unreadable. For a moment he wondered if inviting her here had been too bold. But there was a quiet strength about her, the kind that demanded recognition without a single word. He leaned slightly toward her. Ma'am, he said softly, our Air Force escorts are on the radio. If you'd like, you can say hello. Margaret Ellis blinked slowly. Her eyes drifted toward the headset in his hand. For decades, she had avoided stages, interviews, and speeches. Her service had always been for others, not for recognition. Yet something inside her stirred, a sense that silence, at least in this moment, would be unworthy of those she once stood beside. She nodded, and the captain gently placed the headset over her ears. The hum of static filled her world, layered, with clipped exchanges between the A-10 pilots and air traffic control, call signs, altitudes, coordinates, the same language she remembered from long ago, though spoken by younger voices. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the mic. For a heartbeat, she considered staying silent. But then, with a breath that carried decades of memory, she pressed the switch. "This is Lieutenant Margaret Ellis, Army Nurse Corps, retired," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a firmness, a cadence born of command tents and battlefield hospitals. Silence answered her at first. Then, in the A-10 cockpit, both pilots froze. Viper 1's grip tightened on the throttle. Viper 2 glanced, sideways, his brow furrowing as if to confirm what he'd just heard. The name struck them like a bolt. They had studied it in history classes at the academy, heard it whispered in squadrons as a legend of courage. Could it really be her? Viper 1's voice cracked through the channel, suddenly less rigid, more human. "Ma'am, did you say Ellis? Lieutenant Margaret Ellis?" Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "That's correct," she answered, "though it's been a long time since anyone called me lieutenant." Inside the A-10 cockpits, the men exchanged stunned glances. Their hearts raced, adrenaline pulsing not from combat maneuvers but from the sudden awareness that they were flying alongside living history. They knew her story. The young nurse who had volunteered to deploy with fighter squadrons in Europe. She had been there in the mud, in the chaos, patching up men torn apart by warplanes that screamed overhead. They remembered reading about how she dragged wounded pilots from burning wrecks under artillery fire, how she turned tents into operating rooms, how her hands had worked through exhaustion, blood, and fear. "Ma'am," Viper 2 finally said, his voice low with reverence, "it's an honor to share this sky with you." The cockpit of Flight 227 went quiet. Even the captain, a seasoned aviator who had carried thousands of passengers, felt a lump in his throat. Through the windshield, the A-10s flew steady and strong, no longer just escorts but sentinels standing guard over her. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, the sound of their voices pulling her back across time. She saw faces, young men with flight goggles, their laughter muffled by the weight of war. She remembered the sting of smoke in her lungs, the sting of loss in her chest, and the gratitude of those who had lived because she had refused to leave them behind. She exhaled softly and opened her eyes again. "I was just doing my duty," she said into the mic, her words gentle but edged with truth. The real heroes were the ones who never came home. The frequency went silent again, and then, almost instinctively, both A-10 pilots sat taller in their seats, their posture snapping into perfect military bearing, though no one was watching. In their world, this was not just a conversation. It was a moment to honor someone whose courage had shaped the very tradition they carried in their own uniforms. On board Flight 227, passengers who had overheard fragments of the exchange now leaned closer to the windows. They didn't know the full story, but they sensed something important was happening, something beyond routine flight chatter. The captain glanced at his first officer, then back at Margaret. "Lieutenant Ellis," he said softly, using the title with deliberate respect. "You've just changed this flight." And outside, as the A-10s tightened their escort, it became clear. She was no longer passenger 89. She was a symbol, a voice carried across the airwaves, reminding everyone in the sky of sacrifice, duty, and the kind of courage that outlives decades. In the cockpits of the A-10 Thunderbolts, the silence after Margaret's words was deafening. Neither pilot spoke for a long moment. The roar of the engines, the buzz of instruments, the crackle of the radio, all faded into the background, as the reality of what they had just heard pressed into their minds. Lieutenant Margaret Ellis. The name was carved into their training, their heritage. Every Air Force pilot knew stories of the ground crews and medics who had stood in the mud and smoke alongside the earliest generations of fighter pilots. And, among those names, Ellis had shone brightly. Viper 1 finally broke the silence. His voice, usually clipped and professional, carried something rare. Awe. "Ma'am, I don't think I have the words. We grew up reading about you." Viper 2's voice followed, steadier but tinged with reverence. "You're a legend, Lieutenant. They told us how you pulled men out of wrecked birds while artillery was still falling, how you worked without sleep for days, patching wounds, with whatever you had left. They taught us your story to remind us what courage looks like. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, the headset heavy on her silver hair. She let out a soft chuckle, though her eyes glistened faintly. Legend, she murmured. That word doesn't sit right with me. I wasn't brave, I was just there when they needed me. The real legends were the boys I patched up, the ones who flew anyway, even when they were afraid. The captain of Flight 227, still listening, felt his throat tighten. He glanced at his first officer, who sat motionless, eyes wide, absorbing every word. In all their years of flying, they had carried CEOs, celebrities, even heads of state. But never had their cockpit felt as sacred as it did now, hosting a woman whose life embodied sacrifice in its purest form. Outside, the A-10s held their formation perfectly, their wings gleaming in the sunlight as they slid alongside the passenger jet. To the civilians watching from the cabin windows, it was an impressive show of precision flying, but inside the military cockpits something much deeper was unfolding. Viper 1 adjusted his grip on the controls, his voice thick with emotion. Ma'am, with all due respect, I think you underestimate yourself. We stand on the shoulders of people like you. Without you, without what you and your generation did, none of us would be here. Margaret inhaled slowly, staring out at the gray warplanes flanking them. She remembered other aircraft, P-47, Thunderbolts, and P-51. Mustangs, their paint chipped, their engines coughing smoke as they limped back from missions. She remembered racing to meet them, bandaging wounds, praying over those she could not save. The smell of oil, blood, and earth still clung to her memory like smoke that never quite washed away. You remind me of them, she said softly, her voice breaking just slightly. The way you sit so straight in your seats, the way you carry yourselves, it's the same look. Young men with steel in their spines, determined to do their duty. The words hit the A-10 pilots like a benediction. Neither spoke for a moment, but both felt it, a surge of pride, of connection, of being tethered not just to their generation, but to all who had come before. Back in the passenger cabin, the whispers had grown hushed. Many had overheard fragments of the exchange through the captain's announcements or the faint bleat of radio chatter. Though they didn't know every detail, they felt the weight of it. A businessman who had been typing emails now sat with his hands folded, staring out the window in silence. A young mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin. The teenage boy who first discovered her name on his phone sat bolt upright, realizing he was in the presence of someone who had shaped history. Margaret Ellis was no longer just passenger 89. She was a living link to a time when the world teetered, on the edge of chaos, and people had risen quietly, selflessly to pull it back. Her very presence demanded respect, and the two A-10 pilots responded instinctively, sitting taller, speaking softer, flying sharper. They were not just escorting a commercial airliner anymore. They were escorting a legacy. The sky above the Midwest stretched endless and blue, a sea of clouds rolling beneath the wings of Flight 227. To most passengers, it was a postcard view, serene, forgettable. But for the two A-10 Thunderbolt II pilots flanking the airliner, the air had taken on a different weight. They were not just flying formation anymore. They were flying guard for someone whose very name demanded reverence. Viper 1 adjusted his throttle, bringing his Warthog a few feet closer to the commercial jet. The nose dipped ever so slightly, then rose again, a gesture almost imperceptible to civilians but unmistakable to those who spoke the unspoken language of military flight. It was a bow. Inside Flight 227, passengers craned their necks, pointing through the windows. The warplanes weren't just circling. They were moving with deliberate grace like dancers on a stage. Children squealed with excitement, pressing their faces to the glass. But the adults sensed something else, a formality, a gravity that couldn't be explained by routine maneuvers. In the cockpit of the lead A-10, Viper 1 spoke, his voice firm but softened with respect. Ma'am, permission to tighten formation? Margaret Ellis, seated between the captain and first officer, tilted her head. She hadn't worn a uniform in decades, hadn't given or received an order since the war. Yet here she was, her voice once again the one pilots deferred to. She smiled faintly, nodding. Permission granted. And with that, the A-10s slid into perfect symmetry. Their wings aligned with the airliners, tip to tip, their gray bodies gleaming like guardians etched against the sky. It was no longer an escort. It was a formation of honor. The captain whispered under his breath, "I've never seen anything like this." The first officer, younger and more visibly moved, murmured, "They're saluting her." And they were. Though separated by glass, altitude, and decades of history, the A-10 pilots instinctively sat straighter, their helmets angled forward in disciplined posture. The act wasn't for show. It wasn't for the cameras some passengers now raised shakily toward the windows. It was for her, the woman who had once run into fire, who had once given everything so others could fly again. In the cabin, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Conversations faded into silence. Phones lowered as passengers began to understand that recording wasn't enough. They were living a moment too sacred to reduce to pixels. Eyes welled with tears, hands pressed against windows, and strangers exchanged glances filled not with curiosity, but with shared reverence. Margaret gazed out at the warplanes, her chest rising with a slow breath. Memories surged unbidden. Engines screaming above muddy fields, young pilots staggering from cockpits, her hands trembling as she wrapped bandages by flashlight. She remembered how she would often pause, staring at the very skies where death and salvation collided, never imagining she'd one day sit in comfort, escorted by warriors of a new era. Her voice, quiet but steady, filled the cockpit. "They remind me of the boys I patched up. That look, that discipline. I thought I'd never see it again." The captain swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the formation outside. "Ma'am, you're seeing it because of you. Because you set the example." Down the aisle, a young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Why are the jets flying so close?" she whispered. Her mother, tears streaking her cheeks, whispered back, "Because there's a hero on this plane, sweetheart." The A-10s held their formation for miles, their posture unwavering. They weren't just protecting a flight path. They were standing at attention in the sky, their very wings a salute. It was a gesture beyond protocol, beyond duty, an instinct born of respect that bridged generations. In that suspended moment high above the earth, Margaret Ellis ceased to be simply an elderly woman in seat 22F. She became what she had always been, a beacon of sacrifice, the kind of presence that made even hardened pilots straighten their backs. And though she sat silently, her presence commanded the heavens themselves. The steady formation had already left the passengers in awe, but what came next would etch itself into their memories forever. Inside the lead A-10, Viper 1 tightened his grip on the stick. He had flown hundreds of hours in the Warthog, practiced maneuvers, executed precision rolls, drilled until muscle memory carried him through turbulence and combat simulations. But never had a maneuver carried such weight. This one wasn't for training. This one was for her. "Permission to honor, ma'am?" His voice came through the headset, calm but reverent. Margaret Ellis sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't ask what he meant. She had lived long enough in the company of warriors to understand the language of respect. Her eyes softened, and she gave the smallest nod. "Go ahead, son." With that, the A-10 peeled upward, its engines roaring as it climbed above the commercial jet. Passengers gasped as the warplane arced gracefully, rolling with deliberate slowness before leveling off on the opposite side of the airliner. To those untrained in aviation, it was a stunning aerial display. To the trained eye, it was something far greater, a salute reserved for fallen comrades, now given to one still living. The cabin filled with sound, not fear, but awe. Applause began hesitantly, then swelled until it thundered across the rows. Some passengers clapped, others placed their hands over their hearts. A few simply wept, overwhelmed by the gravity of what they were witnessing. The young man who had first Googled her name leaned forward, whispering fiercely to his mother, "Did you see that?" He saluted her. The pilot saluted her. His mother squeezed his arm, tears running freely down her cheeks. In the cockpit, The captain's voice broke the reverent silence. "Lieutenant Ellis, you've just been given an honor most of us will never see." Margaret's gaze followed the A-10 as it slid back into formation. Her lips pressed together, trembling. For decades she had carried the memories of young men who had never returned from their missions, faces frozen in her mind. She thought of how they would have laughed at such a display, modest as they all were, and how they deserved the honor far more than she did. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, almost to herself. But the captain heard her. He leaned closer, his voice steady. "With respect, ma'am, you do, every bit of it." Passengers leaned into windows, watching the gray warplanes like living symbols of gratitude. A teenager who had been restless earlier sat motionless now, his eyes locked on the jets. A businessman who rarely looked up from his spreadsheets closed his laptop and pressed his forehead to the glass, humbled. Even the children sensed the gravity. Their usual squeals softened into quiet awe. And then, without a word spoken between them, both A-10s adjusted again. This time they dipped their wings in perfect unison, a final gesture of respect, a bow written in steel and sky. The sunlight caught their fuselages, casting long shadows over the clouds, as if even the heavens bent to acknowledge the moment. Inside, the applause swelled again, but it was different now. Not the noisy cheer of entertainment, but the deep, resonant clap of gratitude. Some passengers remained silent, their hands folded, unwilling to break the sacred stillness that lingered even through the noise. Margaret Ellis sat back in her seat, her fingers tracing the seam of her handbag. She had lived nearly a century, had seen the worst and the best of humanity, and had long ago accepted that her story would fade into history books. Yet here, at 35,000 feet, the past had reached out to her, and it had saluted. As the A-10s resumed their steady guard, the flight continued, but no one on board saw it as routine anymore. They weren't just crossing the country. They were traveling inside a moment of history, one they would recount for the rest of their lives. And at the center of it all sat passenger 89. Not invisible, not ordinary, but a quiet nurse whose courage once saved lives and now commanded the skies. The descent began like any other flight. The soft chime, the slight tilt of the nose, downward the shifting air pressure that made ears pop. But for the passengers of Flight 227, nothing about this landing felt routine. They sat differently now, straighter, quieter, as if aware they were carrying something sacred with them to the ground. Through the windows, the A-10 Thunderbolts still held their formation, loyal and unwavering, their engines rumbling like ancient guardians unwilling to leave their post. Even as the city lights of Denver twinkled into view, the warplanes did not break away. They escorted the jet all the way down, a gesture few civilians had ever witnessed. Inside the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to thank you for your patience today. You've been part of something extraordinary. A living hero has traveled with us, and she has reminded us what it means to serve." His voice caught for half a second before he added, "We are honored to have flown with Lieutenant Margaret Ellis." The cabin erupted in applause, not the playful clapping that sometimes greets a smooth landing, but a deep rolling ovation. Strangers turned to smile at her, their eyes bright with respect. Some pressed their palms together as though in prayer. Others simply stared, memorizing her face as if afraid history might slip away again. Margaret sat quietly through it all, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered. Humility had always been her armor. She had never sought recognition. The sound of applause unsettled her almost as much as it warmed her. For her, the greatest honor had always been in the lives that returned home, not in medals or ceremonies. Yet as she looked up at the rows of faces, young, old, weary, hopeful, she felt something stir. Perhaps it wasn't about her at all. Perhaps it was about the reminder that courage, once given, never disappears. It lives on in those who remember. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, the runway lights racing past in neat rows. Passengers gripped armrests and then exhaled in relief. But the awe in the cabin remained unbroken. Even children stayed unusually quiet, their wide eyes flicking between the windows and the woman in 22F. As the aircraft taxied, the two A-10s roared past on either side, climbing skyward once more. Before breaking formation, they dipped their wings one final time, a farewell salute. Gasps echoed through the cabin. Some passengers clapped again. Others simply pressed hands over their hearts. Margaret's eyes followed the warplanes until they vanished into the horizon. She whispered softly, "Safe flight, boys," her voice carrying the weight of every farewell she had ever spoken. When the doors opened, passengers began filing out, still glancing back at her as though reluctant to leave. Normally, travelers rushed down the jet bridge, eager to reunite with loved ones or make connecting flights. But today, many lingered, slowing their steps, reluctant to let the moment end. Margaret waited, letting every soul pass before her. She rose slowly, steadying herself with the seat back, her handbag clutched firmly in her hand. Her movements were deliberate, dignified. She had learned long ago that one does not rush when walking away from something sacred. At the end of the jet bridge, she paused. Through the window, she saw them, a formation of uniformed service members standing quietly on the tarmac. They weren't there for ceremony. There were no cameras, no reporters, just men and women in crisp uniforms standing at attention in the cool night air. Word had traveled ahead of her landing. Soldiers, airmen, and even a few older veterans had gathered, not out of duty, but out of respect. As Margaret stepped into view, they saluted as one. For a moment, she froze, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes shimmering. Then slowly, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and gave a faint nod in acknowledgement. The years seemed to fall away, and once again she was the young lieutenant, steady in the face of chaos, carrying the weight of others with quiet strength. The passengers who had lingered in the terminal watched from behind glass walls, their hearts pounding. They realized they had not just shared a flight, they had shared history. Margaret Ellis walked past the line of salutes with grace, her steps measured, her face calm. She had boarded as passenger 89. She left as a symbol, a reminder that true service doesn't fade with age, that sacrifice echoes across generations, and that respect, when earned through blood and devotion, never dies. And as she disappeared into the terminal, the silence she left behind was louder than applause.